The house was quiet when the phone buzzed on the table beside me. I had been folding laundry, one of those small evening rituals that make an empty house feel less hollow, the screen lit with Rowan's name. And for a moment, my heart lifted my son. Reaching out, I pressed play without hesitation. His voice filled the room, sharp and ragged, carrying the weight of something more than anger. "You never understood me," he began. "You've smothered me my whole life, always watching, always judging. You think buying me things makes you a good mother? It just proves you're useless at everything else." I froze with a towel still in my hands, pressing it against my chest as if cloth could shield me. The message continued. A rush of grievances I'd heard in fragments before, but never with such venom. He blamed me for his failures, his failed relationships, his stalled career. The words spilled like acid, each syllable eating away at the image of the boy I once held against my shoulder. And then came the line that cut deeper than any scalpel I had handled in my nursing years. "I wish you had never been my mother. Useless." 3 minutes and 17 seconds. That was the length of the recording. Long enough to unravel decades of sacrifice. Long enough to turn the room cold. When the message ended, my phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't a new notification, it was the notice that I had been blocked. I sat down on the couch, unable to stand any longer, the towel still clutched in my lap. The silence that followed was suffocating. No chance to respond, no chance to defend myself, no chance even to breathe into the void he had left. I stared at the framed photographs on the mantel Rowan at 5 years old. Cheeks red from running in the park. Rowan at 17, smiling stiffly in his graduation gown. Rowan at 23. Standing beside the used Camry I had bought him. Pride lighting his face. Each picture seemed to mock me now. Silent witnesses of a love that had turned to accusation. I whispered his name, as if the walls could carry it to him. Nothing answered back. I tried to stand, then sat again, my knees suddenly weak. A nurse knows how to manage crises, how to keep her hands steady even when a patient's heart is failing. But nothing in the ICU had prepared me for this, the moment when your own child declares you a mistake. I looked at the clock. 4 hours until midnight. 4 hours since the message arrived would be enough time to decide whether I would keep allowing my life to be defined by his contempt, or whether I would draw a line he couldn't cross again. I rose finally, steadier now, and reached for the folder where I kept all the documents, the condo deed, the car title, the account records. My hands trembled as I set them on the table, but I did not move them away. Because when dawn came, I knew I would have to make a call. The folder lay open on the dining table. Papers fanned out like a silent jury. Deeds, loan statements, bank transfers, all the evidence of the choices I had made in Rowan's name. I touched the corner of one page, tracing the ink as though it could answer the question that had lodged in my chest since the message. Had I given too much, or not enough of the right things? I thought back to the first months after his father died. Rowan was only 12, awkward and angry at the world. I worked nights at the hospital and days at a clinic to keep us afloat. I'd leave him reheated dinners and notes on the fridge, hoping he understood that the empty chair at the table was the price of his future. Every paycheck I split, part for the mortgage, part for food, part set aside for his college tuition, nothing left for vacations, new clothes, or even a second cup of coffee I didn't need. When he turned 18, I cashed out a certificate of deposit I had been nurturing since his birth. It covered his first 2 years at university. I told myself it was worth the exhaustion in my bones, worth the birthdays I had spent on call. Later, when his grades slipped and he dropped out, I took the blame quietly. Maybe I hadn't been home enough. Maybe I hadn't been strict enough. After that, the pattern only deepened. I signed for a condo $410,000, the deed under my name. Because he couldn't qualify on his own, I justified it by telling myself it would give him stability. A roof he wouldn't have to worry about. Then came the Toyota Camry, nearly $27,000. Financed and paid off by me. I still remember his grin the day I handed him the keys. The way he hugged me quickly before running off with friends. Every month since. I transferred money to cover bills, groceries, and the things he never seemed to have enough for. I told myself it was temporary, that once his startup took off, or once he found steady work, he'd repay me not in cash, but in gratitude, in visits, in some sign that he recognized the sacrifices behind each dollar. But the gratitude never came. Instead, there were small lies. Excuses. Long stretches of silence. I filled the silence with more giving, thinking it would buy back closeness. Each time I pressed send on a transfer, I felt both relief and unease, as though I was feeding a hunger that only grew larger. Now, staring at the pile of documents, I saw the shape of my life not as a mother, but as a provider who had confused love with rescue. Was I too soft? Cushioning him from every fall, or too controlling? Keeping everything in my name and never letting him bear the weight himself. The clock ticked toward morning. I closed the folder slowly, knowing the question would not be answered by memory alone. It would be answered by the decision I was about to make, and by the phone call waiting on the other side of sunrise. The night stretched long, each hour dragging its feet, I tried to sleep, but the words from Rowan's message circled back again and again, sharper in the dark than they had been in daylight. By the time the clock reached 2 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the folder as if it might whisper the next step. It had been 4 hours since he blocked me. 4 hours of silence where once there would have been the chance to call, to argue, to plead. The finality of that block was its own answer. He wanted nothing from me but absence. For once, maybe I should give it to him. My phone was still warm in my hand when I scrolled to Ava Lockridge's number. She had handled the paperwork for my pension when I retired from the hospital. Younger than Rowan. Sharp as glass. Ava had a way of making complicated things sound survivable. I pressed call. Her voice came through steady, even at that hour. Isolde, is something wrong? I need you. I said simply, my throat ached from saying the words out loud. I can't keep doing this with Rowan. I need to know how to protect what's mine before I have nothing left. There was no pause on her end, no judgment. Tell me everything. I laid it out in a rush. The condo in my name, the car title, the bank transfers that had become a monthly ritual. I even told her about the voice message. Though my voice shook when I repeated his words, she listened, and when I was finished, she exhaled softly. Then here's what we do, she said. Tomorrow morning you call a tow service. The car is titled to you, it's your property. I'll prepare the paperwork to put the condo on the market immediately. We'll serve Rowan notice and offer him a cash for keys settlement if necessary. You'll be on solid legal ground. I clutched the phone tighter, half expecting guilt to overwhelm me. Instead, a strange steadiness settled in. It wasn't relief, not yet. But it was direction. Are you sure this is the right thing? I whispered. It's not about right or wrong. Ava answered. It's about stopping the bleeding. He has to live on his own terms, and you have to live on yours. Her words echoed through me long after I hung up, for the first time in years. I wasn't plotting how to shield Rowan from consequences. I was planning how to protect myself. The distinction was terrifying and liberating all at once. I placed the phone beside the folder. My decision laid out as clearly as the papers on the table. The condo would be sold, the car would be taken back, the money would stay in my account. Dawn was still hours away, but my course was set. The quiet house no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like the first breath after being underwater too long. By the time sunlight finally spilled across the floorboards, I knew what had to come next, gathering the evidence that would prove just how deep the lies had gone. When the sun finally rose, I felt steadier than I had in weeks. Ava's words lingered in my ears, "Stop the bleeding," if I was going to follow through. I needed to see clearly what I had been blind to for too long. I pulled a shoebox from the hall closet, one that I had used for years to store stray mail and receipts Rowan left lying around when he visited. I had never examined it closely before. He was my son. I thought I didn't need to. The first receipt was from a bar downtown, $200 for cocktails with names I couldn't pronounce. Another showed a shopping trip sneakers worth more than my entire wardrobe budget for a season. Beneath that were printouts of Venmo transfers. Screenshots I had saved in case I ever needed to track where my money was going. Each one labeled with urgency, emergency rent, urgent bills, last-minute tuition. I remembered the nights he called me close to tears, his voice cracking, telling me he would lose his place if I didn't send money immediately. I had sat in this very kitchen, heart pounding, transferring whatever I could spare, believing I was saving him from disaster. And yet, here was the proof while I was giving up dinners out and mending old clothes. He was sipping expensive cocktails and showing off new shoes. My hands trembled as I laid each slip of paper on the table, one after another, until the wood grain disappeared beneath a collage of indulgence. It wasn't survival I had been funding, it was performance, the image of independence, bought with my sacrifices. I thought of the nights I dragged myself through 12-hour shifts at the hospital, the way my back screamed after hours on my feet. I thought of the promises I made to myself that Rowan would never feel the scarcity I had known as a child, that he would never doubt my love. Now it all looked like a terrible equation. My exhaustion multiplied into his entitlement. Anger rose in me, sharper than the sorrow that had filled me the night before. It wasn't just that he had lied. It was that I had allowed myself to be lied to. Every time I looked away, every time I justified another transfer, I had helped him build this fragile, hollow life. I gathered the papers into neat stacks, sliding them back into the shoebox. My breath came slower, my resolve hardening with every movement. These weren't just scraps of paper, they were evidence of a pattern. And patterns, Ava would remind me, were what judges and lawyers respected. I stood and carried the box to the dining table where the folder already waited. Together, they formed the story I had refused to read until now. A story not of a son struggling against misfortune, but of a man living comfortably on a mother's endless guilt. The house felt different as I closed the lid on the box. Lighter, somehow. Though the weight of truth pressed hard against my chest, I knew I couldn't stop here. If I wanted to truly face what Rowan had become, I needed to hear it not just from receipts and bank records, but from the people who had seen the side of him I had refused to believe existed. I carried the shoebox of receipts to the living room and sat staring at it, as if the paper inside might whisper more truths I wasn't ready to hear. But numbers only told part of a story. If Rowan had been living this way for years, then others must have seen what I had been too blind or too unwilling to face. I started with May Whitcomb, my neighbor of 20 years. May had known Rowan since he was a boy, riding his tricycle up and down the cul-de-sac. She had always been friendly, though in recent years I noticed her tight smile whenever I mentioned him. That morning, I walked across her lawn with a heaviness in my chest. May opened the door with her usual warmth, but when I asked if we could talk about Rowan, her expression shifted. She hesitated before inviting me inside. Over cups of coffee, I finally admitted I'd received an audio message from him that left me devastated. I didn't share the cruelest words, those still burned too raw, But I told her I needed honesty about what others had seen. May's eyes softened, then hardened again. Isolde, I don't want to hurt you, but I think you deserve to know. Around here, Rowan. Well, he hasn't been discreet. He's told people more than once that you're, in his words, his personal ATM. He laughs about how you always send money, no matter what excuse he gives. Her words sliced deeper than any receipt. May had heard my son joke about me about my sacrifices. My years of saving and giving as if I were nothing more than a machine dispensing bills. Shame crept over me, hot and suffocating. I nodded, forcing myself to thank her, though every muscle in my face wanted to collapse. Leaving May's house, I felt hollow, like my bones had been scooped out. I walked slowly back to mine, where the shoebox still waited, silent confirmation of everything May had just said. But one voice wasn't enough. I needed more. That afternoon, I called Noelle Jensen, the young woman Rowan had dated for nearly a year before things fell apart. She had always been polite when we met, though distant, as if she carried a private discomfort she couldn't share. When she picked up, surprise filled her voice. But when I explained why I was calling, she exhaled sharply, as though she had been expecting this moment. Mrs. Hargrave, she said carefully. I broke up with Rowan because he wasn't honest. He made me complicit in his lies. He used to tell me he was going on job interviews, but more than once, he admitted he hadn't. He just needed an excuse to ask you for money. He even rehearsed fake details in case you pressed him company names, positions, even the names of imaginary hiring managers. Her voice wavered, guilt mixed in. I should have told you, but I thought it wasn't my place. I thought you knew and were choosing to ignore it. Every word sank like stones into my stomach. Fake interviews, fabricated stories, and me, so eager to believe. Nodding on the other end of the phone, transferring money while congratulating him on being proactive, I thanked Noelle for her honesty. Though my voice cracked, after we hung up, I sat for a long while in the dim light of my kitchen, staring at the same spot on the wall. May had seen me as a machine. Noelle had seen me as a mark. And Rowan, my only son, my flesh and blood, had seen me as nothing but a resource to exploit. The silence in my house grew heavier, pressing against me until I rose, moved to the window, and looked out at the street. Everything looked the same, the children playing, the mail truck rattling past, but I felt as though I had crossed into another world, one where I finally had to face the truth everyone else already knew. And as I stood there, my phone buzzed on the counter with a number I recognized instantly, Ava. By the time I sat down across from Ava's desk, the shoebox of receipts and May's words personal ATM still rang in my ears. I felt exposed, like a patient under fluorescent lights, waiting for the diagnosis I already feared. Ava, crisp in her navy blazer, studied me with that measured gaze lawyers cultivate, equal parts empathy and calculation. Let's start with the car, she said, sliding a notepad across the desk. It's in your name, correct? Yes. Title, insurance, all of it. I just let him use it. Then you have every right to repossess it. We'll file the notice and schedule a tow within 48 hours. He'll be notified, but legally, there's nothing he can contest. Hearing it framed so clinically gave me both relief and nausea. I nodded, clutching my hands together to keep them from trembling. Next, the condo. Ava continued. You purchased it outright. Title in your sole name. Yes, $410,000. Cash from my retirement account. My voice caught on the figure. It still stunned me to admit aloud. Then we can move immediately to list it. I'll draft the notice to vacate 30 days. But we can explore a cash for keys option if you want him out sooner. Sometimes a small payout smooths the transition. I almost laughed, but it came out brittle. Another payout. That's all he's ever known from me. Ava's pen stilled. I need to be frank, Isolde. Once these moves are in motion, your son may never forgive you. This may end your relationship permanently. I met her gaze, steadying myself with the memory of his voice in that cursed message. I wish you had never been my mother. Useless. The words had already scorched everything sacred between us. It already ended in 3 minutes and 17 seconds. I said quietly. Ava didn't flinch. She just nodded, as though she had heard this kind of sentence from other parents who had finally reached their breaking point. She flipped the notepad to a clean page. Then our goal is simple: protect you. No more leaks. No more guilt being weaponized against you. We spent the next hour outlining the steps: tow company scheduled, realtor referral, draft of legal notices, an escrow account where all proceeds would be funneled, out of reach. Each line Ava drew across the paper felt like a stitch closing a wound I hadn't realized was still bleeding. Still, when she paused and looked at me, her voice softened. These papers, they're shields. They'll protect you legally, but they won't protect you from the emotions that will come when he realizes the lifeline has been cut. Her words pressed against the thin armor I had built. I know, I admitted. But maybe it's time he learns to swim without me holding him up. Ava leaned back, folding her hands. Then I'll move everything forward first thing tomorrow. Expect calls from the realtor and the tow yard. And Isolde? I raised my eyes. You're not cruel for doing this. You're finally drawing a line that should have been there years ago. Her assurance lingered with me as I walked back into the cool Tacoma air, a folder of documents tucked under my arm. For the first time, the papers felt heavier than any bag of groceries or stack of overtime charts I'd ever carried. They weren't just contracts or notices. They were the fragile shields between me and the storm my son was about to unleash. And as I slid behind the wheel of my own aging sedan, I knew that storm would arrive sooner than I dared admit. The tow truck arrived just after 8 in the morning. Its rumbling engine echoed down the quiet street, a sound that drew curtains back and neighbors to their porches. I stood in my doorway, arms crossed tight against my chest, watching the men climb out, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Hargrave," one asked. I nodded. My voice lodged somewhere between my throat and stomach. "That's me." He checked the paperwork Ava had prepared, then pointed toward the silver Camry parked neatly at the curb in front of Rowan's condo. My son's car, except, of course, it never had been. Title in my name, insurance in my name, all of it mine, just loaned out like one more extension of my exhausted love. The men worked quickly, backing the truck into position. A heavy hook clanked as they lowered the winch. I felt every sound scrape against me, the screech of chains, the groan of metal tightening. My stomach churned as the Camry's tires lifted from the pavement. From across the street, May Whitcomb stood on her porch, her robe cinched tight, her lips pressed together in something between sympathy and judgment. Other neighbors lingered by their mailboxes, feigning interest in the morning paper, but glancing repeatedly at the scene unfolding. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floorboards and avoid the spectacle. But I stayed planted on my stoop, determined not to flinch. For years, Rowan had flaunted my sacrifices in front of others. Now I would not hide the cost of reclaiming them. The Camry settled onto the flatbed, its familiar profile looking oddly lifeless. How many times had I sat in that passenger seat while Rowan drove me to doctor's appointments or out to dinner? His voice full of promises about the future. Each promise had been a currency, and now I realized most had bounced. "Where should we take it?" "Ma'am," the driver asked. "To the dealership on 6th. I replied, steadying my voice. "They're expecting it." He nodded, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. The truck lurched forward, hauling away the car that had symbolized so many of my misplaced hopes as the sound faded down the block. The nausea rose sharper. I staggered inside and sat at my kitchen table, pressing my palms against the cool wood. The silence afterward was deafening. A vacuum where guilt and relief wrestled inside me. It didn't take long for Rowan's retaliation to arrive. By noon, my phone buzzed with a notification. He had posted on social media. "Can you believe this?" His words blared across the screen. "My own mother just stole my car out from under me. After everything I've been through. Heartless. Cold. Some people shouldn't have kids if they're going to use them as punching bags their whole lives." Dozens of comments already trailed beneath friends I didn't know. Digital strangers consoling him, praising his bravery, damning the faceless mother he painted as cruel and vindictive. A fresh wave of sickness gripped me. He hadn't even tried to reach me first. No phone call, no message, just a public stage where he could play the wounded son. I scrolled further, my breath shallow. Photos of him in bars, arms slung around friends, captioned with words about resilience and betrayal. A video clip of the tow truck rumbling down the street. May's house in the background. Someone must have filmed it. His followers piled on sympathy. For a moment, I nearly typed a reply, ready to defend myself. To say the car was never his. To list every sacrifice, every dollar, every sleepless night. But then, my fingers froze above the screen. Explaining myself to strangers wouldn't erase the truth. It would only deepen the spectacle. I set the phone down, my hands trembling. Let him vent. Let him twist the narrative. My life was no longer measured in likes or comments. What mattered was the quiet knowledge of what I had done and why. Still, the hurt lingered. For years, I had been the doting mother, the one people praised for her dedication. Now, in the eyes of his audience, I was the villain, a cold woman dismantling her son's world. As evening fell, the shadows stretched long across my kitchen floor, and I knew this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring the next step, the notice that the condo was no longer his to keep. The day after the tow, my house felt unnervingly quiet. The Camry's absence was a hollow I couldn't ignore. Still, I pressed forward. Ava had called early, her voice brisk, carrying news I hadn't expected so soon. "We already have a cash buyer interested in the condo," she said. "Investor from Seattle, 14-day close. No contingencies." Her efficiency left no space for me to catch my breath. 14 days. I had lived in that condo only through Rowan, furnishing it with the money I could have spent traveling or repairing my own home. Now it would pass to a stranger, and he would have to face the truth. Nothing he thought was permanent had ever been his. At Ava's office that afternoon, the paperwork was already stacked neatly, her pen waiting. She explained the terms in her calm, measured tone. I nodded along, though my eyes kept drifting to the signature line, trembling with the knowledge of what it meant. Before we signed, she slid another document toward me. "This is the notice to vacate. 30 days is standard, but I've included a cash for keys option, $1,200 if he agrees to leave voluntarily, without damage or legal delay. It's practical. Isolde." Sometimes a small incentive avoids a larger disaster. I stared at the figure. 1,200. How many times had I wired him more than that in a single month? And now, here it was again. Not as support, not as love, but as bait to lure him out of a home that was never truly his. My hand shook as I picked up the pen. Signing my name felt like scrawling across the past 29 years in ink. Each letter curved with memories his first steps in our Tacoma kitchen. The way he clutched my hand at Isabel's funeral, the proud smile at his high school graduation. But beneath those memories ran another thread: the lies, the demands, the voice in that audio message dripping with contempt. "I wish you had never been my mother. Useless." Ava must have noticed my hesitation. "You don't have to feel guilty," she said gently. This isn't about punishment. It's about boundaries. Boundaries. The word sounded clinical, like something from a therapist's office. But boundaries were not foreign to me. I had enforced them with patients for decades, medication schedules, visitor restrictions, code protocols. Yet when it came to Rowan, my boundaries had dissolved into endless exceptions. Today, I was trying to rebuild them, one fragile line at a time. I signed. The pen pressed too hard, leaving grooves through the paper. When it was done, Ava gathered the documents with the efficiency of someone accustomed to finality. "We'll serve the notice tomorrow," she said. "He'll have time to process it. But once the buyer's deposit clears, this train doesn't stop." Walking back to my car, I felt the world tilt slightly, as though I were learning to stand on unfamiliar ground. The air was crisp, the sky a bright slate gray over the Sound, and every breath carried the weight of bridges burning behind me. At home, I sat at the dining table with a cup of chamomile tea, staring at the folder Ava had given me. Inside were the contracts, the notice, the offer of $1,200 that now stood between my son and homelessness. For years, my name had been the foundation under his life. Now it was the signature that pushed it out from beneath him. Night fell, shadows stretching long across the hardwood. I thought of the locks on Rowan's condo door, locks I had paid for, locks he turned without ever understanding the cost. Soon they would be changed, but the real locks weren't on doors, they were inside my chest, fastening tight around the parts of me he no longer had the right to reach. And as I sat in the silence, I knew the storm of his reaction was already on its way. The notice went out on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the parade began. The first call came from my sister-in-law, Sharon, who has never hidden her belief that I spoil Rowan. She cleared her throat in that self-righteous way of hers before launching in. "Isolde, he's distraught. He says you've thrown him out on the street with nothing. I told him you must be exaggerating, but..." "Is it true?" I answered evenly, holding the phone like a weight in my palm. "It's true he has 30 days. And it's true that I've offered him $1,200 if he leaves peacefully. But nothing about this is sudden. Sharon, it's been years in the making." She sputtered, trying to play the role of mediator. But I ended the call with the same phrase I would soon repeat, like a prayer. Words have consequences. So do patterns. By evening, May stopped me in the driveway. Her expression pinched. "Rowan says you blindsided him, Isolde. He looked so shaken yesterday." "I'm sure he did," I replied. But he wasn't blindsided. He was warned for years, he just never believed I would follow through. Friday brought Noelle to my doorstep. She stood awkwardly on my porch, her hands shoved into the pockets of her jacket. "I know I don't have the right," she began, "but Rowan called me, begging me to talk to you. He says he's sorry. He says he didn't mean the things he said." The sight of her stirred something old in me, memories of hoping she might anchor him, bring out the man I wanted to believe he could be. But that hope had ended months ago, and the reality was sharper now. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "Noelle, I appreciate you coming, but apologies spoken through someone else aren't apologies. And regret that only shows up when the money disappears isn't regret, it's desperation." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded. "He told me you'd say something like that. Honestly, I think you're right. He never owned anything when we were together either. When she left, I felt no victory, only a deeper ache. The weekend brought friends of his, voices I barely knew. A young man named Trevor left a voicemail, scolding me for abandoning Rowan. Another, Carlos, if I remembered correctly, sent a text that read, "He's your son, no matter what. Can't you give him another chance?" I deleted the messages without answering. The urge to justify myself tugged at me, but I resisted. Explanations had become another form of surrender, and I had surrendered enough. Sunday night, my brother James called. His voice was low and tired. Isolde. He reached out to me, too. Said you'd lost your mind. I didn't believe him. Not for a second. But I need to ask, are you sure you can live with this? That question caught me off guard. Could I live with being the mother who closed the door? My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. James, I've lived with the opposite for nearly 30 years. With being used, lied to, laughed at. I can live with this better than I can live with that. He sighed heavily, then said, Then I'm on your side. Whatever storm comes, you won't stand in it alone. After we hung up, I sat in the darkened living room, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of the old mantel clock. Rowan's voice had not reached me directly once since the tow truck rolled away, only through others' family. Friends. Even Noel, each carrying his words like offerings. But I had stopped accepting them. My answer was the same to all of them. Words have consequences. So do patterns. And as the days ticked by, I knew the moment would come when he would stop hiding behind messengers and finally face me himself. It was just after 11 when the pounding started. 3 heavy knocks against the front door, followed by a voice I hadn't heard in weeks except in recordings. Mom, please, open up. For a moment, I froze in my chair, the book on my lap sliding to the floor. My first instinct was to stay still, pretend I wasn't home. But the sound of his voice, raw, cracked. Unmistakably, my sons pulled me to my feet before reason could stop me. When I opened the door, Rowan stood there in the yellow wash of the porch light, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His eyes red-rimmed and wild. His hair was unkempt. His clothes wrinkled, as though he had been living out of the bag for days. He looked less like the young man who had strutted through bars with friends and more like the boy I once picked up from sleepovers, anxious and ashamed. Can I come in? He asked, his voice breaking on the last word. I hesitated. That hesitation alone seemed to wound him. It's me, he said again, softer now. I stepped aside. He brushed past me into the living room, dropping the bag with a thud. The smell of stale smoke and sweat clung to him, filling the room. Why are you doing this to me? He demanded before I could speak. His words tumbled out fast, scattered between pleading and accusation. You took my car. You're selling my place. I have nothing left. Do you even care what happens to me? His voice rose, cracked, then broke altogether. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I stood across from him, every fiber of me torn between instinct and resolve. Instinct said to rush to him, pull him close, whisper the kind of reassurances I had whispered since he was small. Resolve told me to stay where I was, to remember the receipts, the lies, the venom of his message. I care, I said finally. My voice was steady, though my chest ached. But caring doesn't mean carrying you anymore. Not when you've turned my love into something to exploit. He lifted his head, his eyes swollen. I was angry. I didn't mean those things. You're still my mom, and you blocked me. I reminded him. You erased me when it suited you. Now you want me back because the safety net is gone. His face hardened, a flicker of the arrogance I had seen too many times. So what? You think I can't survive without you? You think I won't make it? I don't know, I admitted. But I know you won't make it if I keep rescuing you. Silence stretched between us. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly. Each second a reminder that choices had to be made. He looked at the couch, then back at me, his voice trembling. Please, just one night. I have nowhere else. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and opened them again. One night, I said, on the couch. No drinking, no phone calls from friends, no demands. One night to rest. Then you leave in the morning. Relief washed over his face. mingled with something else, resentment, perhaps. That the conditions came from me, he nodded, then sank onto the cushions, already curling into himself like a child. I fetched a blanket from the hall closet and laid it over him. My hand hovered above his shoulder, aching to offer comfort. But I pulled it back. Mercy and weakness wear the same mask, and I could no longer afford to confuse them. As I turned off the lamp, the room dimmed to shadows. Rowan's breathing slowed, uneven but heavy, and I stood there for a moment longer, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Part of me wanted to believe this was the turning point, that the boy I once knew was still buried somewhere inside him, waiting to claw his way back to the surface. But another part knew this was only a pause in the storm, a night's reprieve before the battle resumed. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath me, and slipped into bed, but sleep never came. I lay awake listening to the faint sounds below the rustle of the blanket, the shift of weight on the couch, and wondering whether I had just given him shelter or surrendered ground I couldn't reclaim. When morning came, I knew the next test would be harder, walking with him into the condo and beginning the process of dismantling the life I had built for him, piece by piece. The next morning, Rowan trailed me silently as we walked into the condo. The air inside was stale, as if it too had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. The blinds were half closed, casting slanted shadows across the carpet. I carried a clipboard under my arm, a habit from my nursing years I couldn't shake. When lives were on the line, documentation mattered. And now, though the stakes were different, I clung to the same discipline. We began in the living room, the couch I had bought secondhand, the flat-screen television purchased after one of Rowan's emergency requests, the shelves lined with DVDs I doubted he'd ever watched. I wrote each item down, noting condition, value, location. Rowan threw himself into an armchair, watching me with narrowed eyes. "This is humiliating," he muttered. "You don't need to catalog every fork and pillow. You're treating me like a criminal." I paused, met his gaze, and spoke evenly. "I'm documenting truth. This way, there are no arguments later about what was here and what wasn't. It protects you as much as me." He scoffed, but said nothing more. In the bedroom, I opened drawers and began separating his clothing from the furniture, shirts and jeans into boxes labeled Personal Rowan. The dresser itself went into fixtures and furniture. I taped each box closed and stacked them by the door. The physical labor steadied me, even as my heart clenched at the sight of worn baseball caps and a faded blanket I remembered buying when he was a teenager. Rowan shifted restlessly, arms crossed. "You think writing everything down makes it fair? You're just erasing me." "No," I said quietly, still folding. "I'm making sure the truth is visible. Erasure happens when we lie to ourselves." In the kitchen, I counted plates, mugs, pots, every item I had purchased in the name of giving him a stable home. Each clang of porcelain into cardboard sounded like a gavel striking. Rowan finally snapped, his voice rising. "Why do you have to make it so cold? Couldn't you just trust me for once?" I turned to him, the clipboard firm in my hands. "Trust isn't a gift. Rowan, it's a record. And your record is full of lies. That's why I'm writing this down, so we both remember. Later, what was real." His jaw clenched. For a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or shame, but it vanished before I could hold on to it. By mid-afternoon, the condo was divided into boxes and lists, personal items sealed and labeled, furniture marked for removal, valuables noted for the realtor's records. I stacked everything neatly, as if tidiness could blunt the ache. When I finally set the clipboard down, Rowan stood by the window, arms still folded. His voice was low, brittle. You've made your point. You've turned my life into an inventory sheet. I exhaled slowly, the ache spreading through my chest. No, Rowan. You did that. I'm just the one writing it down. He didn't answer. Instead, he sank onto the bare mattress. His shoulders slumped, staring at the floor as if all the boxes contained not just his belongings, but the fragments of who he thought he was. I gathered my things, locking the door behind us, and felt the finality settle in. The condo was no longer a home. It was a ledger of what had been given and what would soon be taken away. And as I slipped the clipboard back into my bag, I knew the next step would leave no room for doubt, the handover that would close this chapter forever. The morning air in Tacoma was brittle and gray when I returned to the condo for the last time. My footsteps echoed in the hallway outside Unit 3B, the weight of the clipboard pressing against my side like a reminder of all that had already been done. Rowan trailed behind me, his duffel bag heavier now with the boxes I'd packed for him. He hadn't spoken since we left my house, except for muttering under his breath when I asked him to hurry. A paralegal from Ava's office was already waiting at the door, a young woman named Celeste with neat handwriting and a calm expression. She introduced herself politely and held a checklist in one hand, a small brass keyring in the other. "This won't take long," she said. "We'll do a walkthrough. Confirm the unit is clear of damage. Then I'll collect the keys. Once escrow closes at noon, the proceeds transfer to your account. Mrs. Hargrave." Her words were gentle, professional. But to Rowan, they must have sounded like a death sentence. He slammed his bag against the wall. "This is insane. You're seriously letting some stranger throw me out of my own place." "It was never your place," I reminded him softly. "It was mine, and now it won't be either of ours." Celeste glanced between us but continued with her work, moving room to room, making notes. The kitchen cabinets were bare, counters wiped down. The bedroom was stripped of sheets and clothing, only the empty frame of the mattress left behind. Each tick of her pen felt like another nail sealing the door shut. Rowan paced in tight circles. "You don't have to go through with this. You could still cancel. Just give me time to figure things out." His voice cracked, and for a brief moment, I saw not the man, but the boy who once begged me not to leave him alone at night. I steadied myself, clutched the strap of my bag. "I gave you time. Rowan. Years of it. This is what you've done with it." He stopped pacing and glared at me. "You're heartless." "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm finished being heartbroken." Celeste returned to the living room, her checklist complete. "Everything looks in order. All that's left is the keys." She held out her hand. Rowan snatched them from his pocket and threw them onto the counter with a loud clatter. "Fine. Take them. Hope you enjoy the money more than you enjoyed being a mother." The venom in his words made my chest tighten, but I refused to let it break me this time. I picked up the keys, cool metal pressing into my palm, and handed them to Celeste. The exchange was simple, almost too simple for what it symbolized, the closing of a door I had once opened with so much hope. Celeste gave me a small nod. "I'll file this immediately. Congratulations on the sale." Rowan let out a bitter laugh, storming toward the door. "Congratulations? That's rich." He yanked his duffel bag from the floor and walked out without another glance back, his footsteps heavy down the hall until the sound disappeared altogether. For a long moment, I stood in the empty condo, the silence pressing in on me from every corner. The walls, once bright with the promise of a new chapter for him, were now just blank surfaces echoing with absence. I touched the doorframe as I left. A quiet goodbye to a place that had never really become a home. By noon, Ava called to confirm the sale had closed. The funds were in my account. Numbers on a screen that represented more than money. They represented the years I had given, the sacrifices I had made, by the boundary I had finally drawn. irreversible. I sat at my dining table, laptop open, staring at the confirmation email. Relief should have come, but instead there was only a hollow ache, like the echo of a song ending before the last note resolved. I whispered his name once into the quiet house, not expecting an answer. Outside, the afternoon light stretched thin across the yard, and I knew the world had shifted in a way that could never be undone. The roof over my son's head was no longer mine to give, and with that final act, something in me had both broken and mended at once. And as evening crept in, I braced myself for what would follow the fallout of family voices and the silence of my own. The morning after the sale closed, my phone lit up before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. The family group chat, usually quiet, reserved for birthdays and holiday plans, had erupted like a brush fire. Dozens of messages stacked on top of one another, each one harsher than the last. "How could you do this to your own son?" my cousin Marjorie demanded. "You've lost your compassion." Sharon chimed in, always eager to stand on the tallest moral pedestal. Even my brother James, who had promised me his support, wrote with hesitation Isolde. "I don't understand why you had to take everything so far." Their words scrolled endlessly across the screen, each one pressing tighter against my chest. Harsh, cold, unforgiving. The labels piled up until they blurred together. None of them had sat across from Rowan when he begged for rent money while hiding bar tabs in his pocket. None of them had heard the words he spat at me in that voice message. Yet somehow, they felt entitled to measure my motherhood against their own comfortable distance. I set the phone down, face to the table, and let the house grow quiet again. The silence was sharp, but preferable to their noise. I stirred my tea, watching the steam curl and vanish, trying to believe that the ache in my chest would vanish with it. The day passed slowly. I cooked nothing, moved little, simply sat at the dining table as the hours shifted. Afternoon light bled into evening shadows, and still the house remained silent. For the first time in decades, there was no one to answer to, no demand waiting for me to fill it. Freedom and loneliness felt like two sides of the same coin, spinning endlessly on the table before me. It was nearly dusk when a knock at the door startled me. For a moment, I braced for Rowan, returning with another round of anger. But when I opened it, May stood on the porch, a pot of soup cradled in her hands. "I thought you might not have eaten," she said simply, stepping inside without waiting for permission. We sat together at the table, the aroma of lentils and rosemary filling the room. She ladled soup into bowls and set one in front of me, her presence both ordinary and extraordinary in its quietness. "I heard the whispers," May said after a moment. "People saying you went too far, that you're cruel." She looked at me steadily. "Don't let them rewrite the story. Mercy without boundaries is theft, and you've been robbed long enough." The words landed in me like stones dropped into deep water, sending ripples outward. I had been robbed of time, of energy, of dignity, and every time I handed Rowan more without demanding anything in return, I had been the accomplice to my own theft. I ate slowly, the warmth spreading through me, loosening the knot that had been lodged in my chest all day. May didn't press, didn't fill the silence with empty comforts. She simply sat, sipping her soup, her presence saying what words could not, that I wasn't entirely alone. When she left, she squeezed my shoulder gently at the door. "Don't let the noise make you doubt. You've done what most can't." The house fell quiet again, but it no longer felt like a punishment. I carried my bowl to the sink, rinsed it, and stood at the window watching the street lamps flicker on one by one. The world outside continued, indifferent to my choices. Yet I felt the faintest glimmer of steadiness return, and though the group chat still buzzed on my phone across the room, I no longer rushed to silence it. The judgments of others were only echoes. What mattered now was what would come next, the life I was beginning to shape without Rowan at the center. After the sale closed, I spent several days staring at the numbers on my bank statement, unable to reconcile them with the years of sacrifice that had emptied me out. The balance was larger than anything I had ever seen attached to my name. Yet it felt strange, almost borrowed, as if I were waiting for someone to snatch it back. For decades, money had passed through my hands only to land in Rowan's. Now, for the first time, it sat still, mine. I began to sketch out a plan. Old habits guided me: lists, categories, neat columns of figures. But instead of writing Rowan rent, or Rowan utilities, or Rowan car insurance, I wrote my own name: Isolde Retirement Cushion, Isolde Travel Fund, Isolde Home Repairs. The words looked foreign, indulgent, even selfish. And yet, slowly, they began to feel like truth. One line I underlined twice: nursing scholarship. I had spent 40 years in intensive care, often wishing I could ease the burden for younger nurses drowning in student debt. I decided to endow a modest scholarship at the community college where so many new nurses began. It wasn't much by institutional standards, but it would lift someone's shoulders just enough for them to breathe. That felt like money becoming more than survival. It became legacy. Another line carried a dream I had tucked away for years: coastal cabin. Nothing extravagant. Nothing glossy from a magazine spread, just a small place on the Washington coast, where I could hear the water and smell the salt, where silence meant peace instead of abandonment. I called a realtor just to inquire. And for the first time in years, my voice didn't shake when I asked about possibilities. Still, guilt lingered like a shadow. I caught myself calculating what Rowan would say if he knew, accusing me of hoarding what he believed was rightfully his, mocking the scholarship as some empty gesture, dismissing the cabin as proof I had turned my back on him. I pressed those thoughts down, reminding myself of May's words: mercy without boundaries is theft. Each dollar now had a new meaning, not as a tool to rescue him, but as a thread to weave the rest of my life. I imagined walking along the shore outside that cabin, imagined a young nurse opening a letter that said her tuition was covered, imagined repairing the leaky roof of my own home without asking anyone for help. These weren't luxuries, they were anchors. One evening, I sat at the table with the folder open and whispered aloud, as if Rowan were across from me, "This was never about taking from you. It's about finally giving something back to myself." The room answered only with its familiar silence, but I felt steadier hearing the words in my own voice. The math had changed. For years, every calculation began with him and ended with me carrying the remainder. Now, for the first time, the sum balanced in my favor. I closed the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and looked toward the window where the street lamps flickered on. Outside, life went on in its ordinary rhythm. Inside, I was learning to count differently. And, as the days stretched into weeks, I knew Rowan's story had not ended because his silence was already beginning to crack. Months passed before I heard anything concrete about Rowan. His silence had stretched long enough that I began to assume he had vanished into the same haze he'd once lived in: nights of bars, mornings of excuses. But then, word trickled back through May, who had overheard a neighbor's nephew talking about him. Rowan had taken a job at a grocery store across town, shelving items during the night shift. I pictured him there. The boy who once scowled at chores, now restacking cereal boxes and canned beans. His back aching the way mine had after long shifts at the hospital. The thought filled me with a complicated swell of feelings: sorrow that it had come to this, relief that he was finally learning, pride tangled with ache. Without a car, he rode the city bus, lugging his duffel bag from one rented room to another. The Camry was long gone. The condo no longer his refuge. Instead, he was learning the rhythm of timetables and the limits of schedules. The humbling life of someone who had to plan every step instead of assuming someone else would smooth the way. Through another acquaintance, I learned he was living in a small rented room above a garage. Barely enough space for a bed and a narrow desk. I tried to picture him there, hunched over, stripped of the luxuries I had poured into his life for so long. He had begun, they said, to write letters, notes, fragments. At first full of blame how unfair I had been, how heartless, but later more hesitant, softer, drafts of apologies he never sent, scribbled in the margins of notebooks or typed into his phone, only to be deleted before sunrise. I imagined him crossing out line after line, words that might have bridged the gap between us if he had let them. And I wondered, was he ashamed? Or was he afraid that sending them would mean he had to change for good, some nights? As I sat at my dining table balancing the scholarship fund paperwork or flipping through cabin listings on the coast, I felt his absence like a bruise. Pride whispered that I had done the right thing, that he was finally standing on his own legs, even if they shook. But another part of me, the part that had once held him through fevers and nightmares, ached to ease the struggle. I didn't reach out. Not yet. He needed space to stumble, to bruise, to harden into someone who could survive without leaning on me. Still, the silence grew heavy, filled with all the words he wasn't ready to speak, and all the ones I couldn't bring myself to offer first. I folded the thought away like the unsent letters he kept drafting, and I waited, because eventually, I knew something would break the stillness. A message, a call, a letter that carried more truth than excuse. And when it came, I would have to decide whether to open it. It came on a Tuesday, slipped through the mail slot with the usual bills and flyers. At first, I almost tossed it aside, just another envelope in the clutter. But the handwriting on the front stopped me, slanted, uneven, and yet familiar in a way that tugged at me like an old song. Rowan. I carried it to the table and sat down, the weight of it heavier than paper should allow. 8 pages, folded neatly inside, written on lined notebook paper. His penmanship had always been sloppy, but here it was steadier, deliberate, as though each word had been pressed into place by force. I unfolded the first page and began to read. He started with the obvious apologies, admissions of cruelty, confessions about the voice message. He didn't skirt around it, didn't offer excuses. I said what I did because I wanted to hurt you, he wrote. And I succeeded. That's the part that makes me sick. I knew where to cut, and I cut there. You didn't deserve that. Page after page. He dismantled the lies he had told me. The job interviews that never existed, the rent emergencies that were really bar tabs, the promises he had crafted with just enough detail to keep me believing. He wrote about the sneakers, the cocktails, the nights of laughter at my expense. I wanted to believe you would never stop giving, he admitted, because if you never stopped, I'd never have to start. The letter shifted, though, into something I hadn't expected. Tucked into the envelope were copies of pay stubs from the grocery store, wrinkled but real, and a photograph of a small notebook filled with scribbled figures: his budget, tracking bus fare, rent, groceries. It's humiliating to live like this, he wrote. But I've learned more in 4 months than I did in all the years you covered for me. By the 5th page, my hands were trembling. He wrote of nights lying awake, drafting apologies he couldn't bring himself to send, of deleting messages because he was afraid I wouldn't believe him. I didn't need a softer mother. One line read, I needed a stronger spine, yours first, then mine. That sentence pierced me in a way the insults never had. It was both an indictment and a strange kind of gratitude. But as I reached the final pages, doubt began to seep in. He wrote of wanting a second chance, of wanting me to see he was changing. He didn't ask for money, not directly, but he asked for time, for patience, for me to believe in him again. Was it honesty or just another performance crafted from my deepest desires? I couldn't tell. His words read like truth, yet I had been fooled by words so many times before. I set the letter down, staring at the stack of paper that could either be a bridge or another trap. My heart ached to believe it. To imagine Rowan clawing his way out of the pit he had dug. To imagine him becoming a man who could finally stand tall without leaning on me. But another part of me, the part hardened by years of receipts and broken promises, whispered caution. For hours, I left the letter on the table, circling it like a wary animal. I made tea, washed dishes, even stepped outside to water the plants. But every time I returned, it sat there waiting, demanding an answer I wasn't sure I had the strength to give. That night, I tucked the pages back into their envelope and placed it in the drawer with my important papers. Not discarded, not displayed, just waiting, like a question mark I couldn't erase. And as I closed the drawer, I knew I wouldn't be able to leave it there forever. At some point, I would have to see him again, face to face, to decide whether those words carried truth or manipulation, or perhaps both. 2 weeks after the letter, I agreed to meet Rowan. We chose neutral ground, a public park near the Sound, where benches faced the water and families wandered by with dogs and strollers. I arrived early, clutching a thermos of coffee from home, my pulse unsteady. He was already there, sitting on a bench with his shoulders hunched, a paper cup in his hands. When he lifted his head, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked thinner, his hair shorter, his posture subdued. The arrogance that once walked into every room ahead of him had been replaced by something quieter. "Mom," he said simply, rising to his feet. I nodded. We stood for a moment, an awkward space stretching between us, before we sat side by side on the bench. The smell of salt water drifted in the air. Children's laughter carried faintly from a playground nearby. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said after a while. His voice was softer than I remembered, without the sharp edges I'd braced for. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But your letter, it deserved an answer." He stared down at his cup. "I meant what I wrote. All of it." We sat in silence, letting the words settle. I studied his hands, calloused now, faint lines of ink across his knuckles. He had been working, truly working. And the evidence was etched into him more clearly than any pay stub. "I'm not here to ask for money," he added quickly, as if anticipating my fear. "I'm not here to move back in, or to borrow. I just wanted to see if you'd sit with me." Relief washed through me, tangled with sorrow. "Then let's sit," I said. We sipped our coffee together, speaking in fragments about his job, his tiny rented room, the co-workers who teased him for being older than most of the staff. He laughed once, briefly, and the sound startled me. It wasn't carefree, it was tentative, almost fragile. But it was real. After a long pause, I turned to him. "Rowan, if we're going to try again, it has to be different. There are rules now. Respect, honesty, no money changing hands. We meet quarterly 4 times a year. Not when you're desperate, not when I'm feeling guilty. Just steady, like clockwork." He swallowed hard, nodded. "Quarterly, I can do that. And if you slip," I asked gently, "then you stop showing up, and that's on me." I studied him, searching for the smirk or the eye roll that used to follow his promises. None came. Only a man, tired and raw, trying to rebuild something out of the wreckage. We finished our coffee in silence, the quiet between us less hostile than it had once been. When he rose to leave, he hesitated, then opened his arms slightly. For a moment, I considered refusing, guarding the boundaries I had drawn, but I stepped forward, allowed his arms around me, brief and careful. His chest shook once against mine before he pulled away. "I'll see you in 3 months," he said. His voice steadier than I expected. I nodded. 3 months. As he walked away, his shoulders were still bent, but not in defeat, more in humility, like someone learning how to carry his own weight. I turned toward home, the thermos empty in my bag, the ache in my chest lighter than it had been in years. The path stretched ahead of me, lined with fading sunlight and the promise of space that was finally mine. When dignity returns, is reconciliation the reward or simply the proof you survived? Title thumb. Main character name, Isolde Hargrave, 66. Title, my son sent me a voice message and blocked me. I wish you had never been my mother. Useless. Then, thumbnail, my son sent me a voice message and blocked me. I wish you had never been my mother. Useless. 4 hours later, I called my lawyer. His house and car, under my name, had already been sold. Description. Hearing my own son tell me I wish you had never been my mother. Useless shattered me. After years of sacrifice, I finally chose dignity over silence. This is my story of loss, strength, and survival. Subscribe to Historias con Elena for more powerful life stories, and share in the comments what you would have done in my place. Aiki. Título. Mi hijo me envió un mensaje de voz y me bloqueó. Ojalá nunca hubiera sido mi madre. Inútil. Entonces, minuta. Mi hijo me envió un mensaje de voz y me bloqueó. Ojalá nunca hubiera sido mi madre. Inútil. 4 horas después. Llamé a mi abogado su casa y su coche, a mi nombre. Ya se habían vendido. Descripción. Escuchar a mi propio hijo decirme, ojalá nunca hubiera sido mi madre. Inútil. Me destrozó. Después de años de sacrificio, finalmente elegí la dignidad por encima del silencio. Esta es mi historia de pérdida, fortaleza y supervivencia. Suscríbete a Historias con Elena para leer más historias de vida conmovedoras y comparte en los comentarios qué habrías hecho en mi lugar.